March 15, 1945. The eastern German countryside trembled under the advance of two massive military forces converging from opposite directions. In a converted textile factory near the town of Torgau, approximately 200 German women auxiliary personnel huddled together, their world collapsing around them as the sounds of distant artillery grew steadily closer. These women had served in communications, administration, and medical support roles for the German armed forces during the conflict, and now they found themselves trapped between advancing armies, certain that their fate would be unspeakable. Little did they know that their deepest fears and longest-held beliefs were about to be shattered in ways they could never have imagined. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a desperate standoff rooted in years of ideological conditioning would transform into one of the most profound human awakenings of the entire conflict, proving that compassion and medical expertise could transcend the deepest divisions of hatred and propaganda. The women gathered in the factory basement represented a cross-section of German society from that turbulent era. There was Margaret Fischer, 32 years old, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had volunteered for auxiliary service in 1942 after her husband was deployed to the Eastern Front. She had risen to the rank of senior communications specialist, coordinating message traffic between field units and headquarters. Her careful records showed she had processed over 15,000 communications during her 3 years of service, each one a small piece of the vast military operation she had believed was protecting her homeland. Beside her sat Helga Zimmermann, only 24, but already a veteran of 2 years in the Signals Corps. She had grown up in Berlin, the daughter of a postal worker and a seamstress, and had joined the auxiliary forces with genuine enthusiasm, believing the propaganda that portrayed the conflict as a defensive necessity. Her technical skills had been exceptional, and she had been commended 7 times for her efficiency and dedication. Now those commendations seemed like relics from another lifetime. Also among them was Ilse Braun, 28 years old, who had served as a medical records clerk. Before the conflict, she had been studying to become a pharmacist at the University of Munich, but her education had been interrupted by the escalating demands of total mobilization. She had spent 3 years organizing patient files, supply requests, and treatment protocols at various field hospitals. Her meticulous nature had made her invaluable to the medical staff, and she had seen enough wounded personnel to understand the true cost of the conflict, even if she had not questioned its purpose. The youngest among the leadership group was Greta Hoffmann, just 21 years old, who had joined the auxiliaries straight from her small village in Bavaria. She had been assigned to administrative duties, typing reports and maintaining personnel records. Her innocence had been gradually eroded by the realities of military life, but she still clung to the beliefs she had been taught since childhood. Her hands trembled as she clutched a photograph of her family, wondering if she would ever see them again. These women and nearly 200 others had been stationed at the communications facility in Torgau for the past 8 months. The factory had been converted into a signals hub, coordinating communications across a wide sector of the deteriorating front lines. As the military situation collapsed throughout early 1945, the facility had become increasingly isolated. Supply deliveries had become sporadic, then ceased altogether. The male officers and soldiers who had provided security had gradually been redeployed to combat units, leaving the women essentially on their own. By early March, it had become clear that evacuation was impossible. The transportation networks had broken down, fuel was non-existent, and the roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the advancing forces. The senior officer who had commanded the facility, a communications major named Werner Scholz, had departed on March 10th with the last vehicle, taking the remaining male personnel with him. He had left instructions for the women to destroy sensitive equipment and documents, then attempt to make their way westward on foot. But the women had nowhere to go. The front lines were fluid and chaotic. Reports filtering in from other refugees painted terrifying pictures of what happened to military personnel caught in the open. The women decided that their best chance for survival was to remain in the factory basement, destroy their uniforms and documents, and attempt to pass as civilian factory workers. when the inevitable occupation occurred. Margaret had taken charge of the group by unspoken consensus. Her education and maturity made her a natural leader, and the younger women looked to her for guidance. She organized the destruction of military materials, supervised the distribution of remaining food supplies, and tried to maintain some semblance of order and morale as they waited for whatever would come. The ideological conditioning that had shaped these women's worldview ran deep. Throughout their service, they had been exposed to constant messaging about the nature of their adversaries, particularly regarding soldiers from different backgrounds and ethnicities. The propaganda had been relentless and pervasive, painting terrifying pictures of what would happen if enemy forces occupied German territory. These messages had been reinforced through official channels, informal conversations, and the general atmosphere of the military culture they had inhabited for years. Among the fears that gripped the women as they waited in that basement, one stood out with particular intensity. They had been taught that African American soldiers in the American military were dangerous, uncivilized, and would show no mercy or respect to German women. These racist falsehoods had been repeated so often and with such conviction that they had become accepted truth among the population. The women genuinely believed that if they were captured by such troops, their fate would be worse than anything they could imagine. On the morning of March 15th, the artillery sounds that had been distant background noise for days suddenly intensified. The women could hear the distinct crump of explosions, some close enough to rattle the factory windows. Margaret gathered the group together for what she feared might be a final discussion. The basement was cold and damp, lit by a few oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the concrete walls. The women sat on salvaged wooden crates and moth-eaten mattresses that had been dragged down from the factory dormitories. Their faces showed the strain of sleepless nights and constant fear. Many were crying quietly. Others stared into space with expressions of numb resignation. Margarete stood before them, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. She was tall and thin, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face lined with exhaustion. She had changed from her military auxiliary uniform into a simple grey dress salvaged from the factory storage room. Most of the other women had done the same, trying to erase any evidence of their military connection. "Listen to me, all of you," Margaret said, her voice carrying authority despite its tremor. "We have destroyed all documents, all uniforms, everything that could identify us as military personnel. When they come, we are civilian factory workers. We were making textiles, nothing military. We know nothing about military operations. We are just women who worked here to survive." Helga raised her hand tentatively. She had been crying and her eyes were red and swollen. "But what if they don't believe us? What if they can tell we were with the military?" "They won't be able to tell," Margaret insisted, though she was far from certain. "We have rehearsed our story, we stick to it, we are textile workers, that's all." Ilse spoke up from her corner, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if they're—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what she meant. A heavy silence fell over the group. This was the fear that haunted them most acutely, the terror that had been branded into their consciousness by years of propaganda. The possibility that American forces might include African American units, and that those units might be the ones to occupy Torgau. "We stay together," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever happens, we stay together. We are strong. We will survive this." But even as she spoke these words, Margaret felt doubt gnawing at her. She had no idea what to expect, no framework for understanding what would happen when occupation forces arrived. Everything she thought she knew had been filtered through the lens of ideology and propaganda. She was terrified that the reality might be even worse than what she had been told. The sound of engines grew louder throughout the afternoon. Heavy vehicles were moving through the town, their diesel rumble unmistakable even through the thick basement walls. The women fell silent, listening with desperate intensity to every sound. There were shouts in the distance, but the language was unclear. Occasional bursts of small arms fire punctuated the growing dusk, each one making the women flinch. As darkness fell on March 15th, the factory remained untouched. The women allowed themselves a small measure of hope that perhaps they had been overlooked, that the occupation forces were focused on military objectives and had no interest in an abandoned textile factory. They rationed out their evening meal, a meager portion of bread and canned vegetables per person. The food supplies were running critically low. Another 3 days, perhaps 4, and they would have nothing left. Greta was assigned to keep watch at the top of the basement stairs, where a small window looked out onto the factory floor. Every hour another woman would relieve her, maintaining a constant vigil. As midnight approached, Greta peered through the grimy window and froze. There were lights moving outside the factory, flashlight beams sweeping across the building's exterior. She scrambled down the stairs, nearly falling in her haste. "They're here!" she gasped. "Vehicles outside, lights, I think they're coming in." The basement erupted in panicked whispers. Women clutched each other, some praying quietly, others simply staring at the stairs with wide, terrified eyes. Margaret fought to maintain control, raising her hands for silence. "Remember what we discussed," she said urgently. "We are textile workers. We know nothing. We are not a threat. Stay calm." But calm was impossible. The women could hear boots on the factory floor above them, multiple sets of footsteps, the sound of equipment being moved. Voices called out in English, the words incomprehensible to most of the German women who had studied only basic English in school years ago. Then came the sound they had been dreading, footsteps on the basement stairs. The door at the top of the stairs swung open, and bright flashlight beams swept into the basement, temporarily blinding the women huddled below. Several figures descended the stairs, their silhouettes backlit by the lights. As the figures reached the basement floor and the flashlight beams steadied, the women could see their captors clearly for the first time. The soldiers were American. That much was obvious from their uniforms and equipment. But what sent a wave of pure terror through the assembled women was the realization that these soldiers were African American. The propaganda's most dire warnings seemed to be coming true. Several women screamed, others began crying hysterically. Some simply froze, unable to move or speak. The lead soldier, a sergeant whose name tape read Jackson, stopped abruptly, clearly surprised by the intensity of the reaction. He was a man of medium height, probably in his late 20s, with a steady, professional demeanor. He raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Easy now," he said in English, his voice calm and reassuring. "We're not going to hurt you. You're safe." But his words were meaningless to most of the terrified women who did not understand English. What they saw were armed soldiers of exactly the type they had been taught to fear most, standing between them and escape. The panic intensified. Margaret, drawing on reserves of courage she did not know she possessed, stepped forward. She had studied English in university and could understand basic phrases, though her speaking ability was rusty. "Please," she said in heavily accented English, "please, we are only workers, factory workers, textiles, no military." Sergeant Jackson's expression softened with understanding. He recognized immediately what was happening. He had seen this reaction before in other occupied towns. This terror that went beyond normal fear of enemy soldiers. He knew exactly what these women had been told about him and his men, and he felt a familiar mixture of anger and sadness at the poison of such hatred. "Ma'am," he said slowly and clearly, "we're medical personnel, medics. We're here to help, not hurt. Do you understand? Medical. Help." He pointed to the Red Cross insignia on his helmet and on his armband. The other soldiers with him, also African-American medics, did the same, showing their medical insignia clearly. Margarete translated haltingly to the other women. The news that these soldiers were medical personnel caused some of the panic to subside, replaced by confusion. This did not fit the narrative they had been taught. Enemy soldiers, especially those they had been told to fear most, were not supposed to be medical personnel coming to help. "How many of you are here?" Jackson asked, his voice remaining calm and professional. "Anyone injured? Sick?" Margaret struggled to translate, her English failing her at crucial moments. Finally, she managed to convey that there were approximately 200 women in the basement, that they had been without adequate food for several days, and that several women were ill. What Margaret did not tell Jackson, because she did not yet know, was that the situation was far more serious than simple hunger and minor illness. Among the women huddled in the darker corners of the basement were several who were desperately ill, their conditions having deteriorated rapidly over the past few days. The group had been trying to care for them with their limited resources, but medical expertise and supplies were non-existent. Jackson instructed one of his men to go back upstairs and report the situation to their commanding officer. Then he and the other medics began a preliminary assessment of the basement, their flashlights revealing the squalid conditions in which the women had been living. The cold, the damp, the inadequate sanitation, the visible signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. "We need to get you out of here," Jackson said to Margaret. "This place is not safe or healthy. We have a medical facility set up in the town. Hot food, clean water, proper shelter." Margaret translated, but the response from the women was not what Jackson expected. Instead of relief, there was renewed fear and resistance. The women did not want to leave the basement. They did not want to go with these soldiers, regardless of whether they were medical personnel or not. The propaganda had done its work too well. "Please tell them," Jackson said with obvious frustration, "that we are here to help. We are medics. It's our job to take care of people, all people. We will not hurt them, but they cannot stay here. Some of them are very sick and need treatment." Margaret tried to convey this, but the women's resistance remained strong. They whispered among themselves, their fear palpable. Finally, Helga spoke up, her voice shaking but defiant. "Tell them we won't go with them. Tell them we would rather stay here, no matter how bad it is. Tell them to leave us alone." Jackson closed his eyes briefly, struggling with his own emotions. He had been in the military for 4 years, had served as a medic through some of the most intense operations of the conflict, had treated countless wounded soldiers from both sides. He had faced danger, exhaustion, and the constant presence of suffering and loss. But this wall of racist fear directed at him simply because of his skin color, this was a wound that never seemed to heal. "Listen to me," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I am a trained medical professional. I have saved lives, many lives, including German lives. I don't care what you've been told about me or my men. Right now there are sick people in this basement who need medical attention. That's not negotiable. I will treat them here if I have to, but it would be much better if we could move everyone to proper facilities." A commotion from the far corner of the basement interrupted the tense standoff. A woman named Elizabeth Kohler, 36 years old, had collapsed. She had been struggling with severe illness for the past 3 days, but had been trying to hide how bad it was, not wanting to burden the group. Now she lay on the cold concrete floor, convulsing, her body racked with fever. Several women screamed and clustered around Elizabeth, not knowing what to do. Jackson immediately moved toward the commotion, his medical training overriding everything else. But as he approached, the women formed a protective barrier around their fallen comrade. "Don't touch her," Helga shouted in German, spreading her arms to block Jackson's path. "Get away from her." Jackson stopped, his hands raised. "Ma'am, I am a medic. That woman is having a medical emergency. I need to help her now, or she could lose her life. Please, let me help." Margaret, witnessing the severity of Elizabeth's condition, made a split-second decision that would change everything that followed. She stepped forward and physically pulled Helga aside. "Let him through," she said firmly in German. "Let him help her. She's going to perish if we don't do something." The other women reluctantly parted, though their fear remained evident. Jackson immediately knelt beside Elizabeth, his movements swift and professional. He checked her pulse, her breathing, examined her eyes with a small penlight. His face grew grave. "She has a very high fever," he said. "Possibly pneumonia, maybe something worse. How long has she been like this?" 3 days sick," Margaret managed in English. "Getting worse." Jackson called to one of his fellow medics, a young man named Williams, who carried additional medical supplies. Together they began treatment, working with practiced efficiency. They administered fluids, checked vital signs, applied cooling measures to bring down the fever. All the while, they maintained a professional demeanor, their focus entirely on their patient. The women watched in stunned silence. This was not what they had expected. The gentleness of the medic's touch, the obvious expertise of their actions, the genuine concern in their voices as they discussed treatment options, all of it contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. "We need to move her," Jackson said after several minutes of treatment. "She needs proper medical care, antibiotics, intravenous fluids. We have all of that at our facility, but not here. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. Move her. Help her. Jackson and Williams carefully lifted Elizabeth onto a stretcher they had brought down from upstairs. As they carried her toward the stairs, Jackson paused and turned back to the assembled women. "Are there any others who are seriously ill?" he asked. "Please, if there are, tell me now. Their lives may depend on it." There was a long silence. Then, reluctantly, several women spoke up. There were 5 others who were in bad condition, suffering from various ailments that had worsened over their days in the basement. Severe infections, respiratory illnesses, one case of what looked like appendicitis. Jackson's expression showed both concern and determination. "We're going to treat them all," he said firmly. "But I need cooperation. I need you to trust us, at least enough to let us do our jobs." Over the next 2 hours, Jackson and his team worked steadily in the basement, conducting triage and providing emergency treatment to those most in need. They were joined by additional medical personnel, including several white American medics and a doctor. Captain Robert Green, who took charge of the medical operation. Green was a 42-year-old physician from Philadelphia, a man who had practiced medicine for 15 years before being commissioned into the military medical corps. He had seen his share of suffering during the conflict, but he was shocked by the conditions he found in the basement and by the level of fear the women displayed. "These women have been through hell," he said quietly to Jackson as they worked together to stabilize one of the patients. "And it looks like they're more afraid of us than they are of starvation or disease." "They've been taught to be afraid," Jackson replied evenly. "Propaganda is a powerful poison." Green nodded thoughtfully. "Then I suppose we'll have to be the antidote." As the night wore on, the medics gradually earned small measures of trust through their actions. When they treated the sick women with gentle care and obvious competence, when they brought down supplies of food and clean water and distributed them freely, when they showed respect and professionalism despite the hostile reception they had received, the wall of fear began to develop tiny cracks. By dawn on March 16th, all 6 of the seriously ill women had been stabilized and transported to the American medical facility that had been established in a former school building in the center of Torgau. Margaret and a small group of other women had agreed to accompany them, still fearful but unable to abandon their sick friends. What they found at the medical facility challenged their preconceptions even further. The Americans had established a well-organized field hospital with multiple treatment areas, supply storage, and recovery wards. Medical personnel moved with purpose and efficiency, treating wounded American soldiers, civilian refugees, and even captured German military personnel without apparent distinction. Margaret watched in amazement as African-American medics worked alongside white American medics, treating patients of all backgrounds. She saw Jackson carefully bandaging the wounded arm of a German soldier who had been brought in from a nearby skirmish. The German soldier, a young man no more than 20 years old, looked terrified at first, but Jackson's gentle competence gradually calmed him. "You're going to be fine," Jackson said in his limited German, words he had learned through months of treating German casualties. "Arm will heal. You are safe now." The German soldier stared at Jackson with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if his entire understanding of the world had just been inverted. Margaret knew exactly how he felt. Over the following days, the situation at the factory basement gradually resolved. The remaining women were eventually persuaded to relocate to better shelter, though it required patience and repeated demonstrations of good faith from the American forces. Food supplies were provided along with clean water, proper sanitation facilities, and medical screening for all. But the real transformation was happening on a deeper level, in the minds and hearts of women who were being forced to confront the lies they had believed. Every interaction with the African-American medics challenged their indoctrination. Every act of kindness, every moment of professional medical care, every demonstration of human decency chipped away at the edifice of hatred that had been constructed in their minds. Ilse, the former medical records clerk, found herself working alongside the American medics, helping to translate and assist with treatment of the German women. Her medical background made her valuable to the operation, and Captain Green quickly recognized her competence. She spent hours each day in the field hospital, observing and learning. One afternoon, about a week after the initial occupation, she found herself assisting Jackson with the treatment of a German woman named Anna who had developed a serious wound infection. Jackson worked carefully, cleaning the wound, applying antibiotics, changing dressings. His touch was gentle, his manner calm and reassuring. "You're very good at this," Ilse said in halting English, watching his technique. Jackson glanced at her with a slight smile. "I've had a lot of practice. 3 years as a combat medic will teach you a lot." "Where did you learn medicine?" Ilse asked, genuinely curious. "Howard University," Jackson replied, concentrating on his work. "Medical school in Washington, D.C. I was in my 3rd year when the conflict began. Finished my degree in the military medical program." Ilse was stunned. "You went to university? To medical school?" Jackson looked at her more carefully, recognizing the prejudice behind her surprise. "Yes, ma'am. African Americans can go to university, can become doctors, can be educated professionals. Might not be what you were taught, but it's the truth." Ilse felt her face burn with shame. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean... I was just..." "You were taught lies," Jackson said, not unkindly. "It's not your fault that you believed them, but now you know better." This conversation was replicated dozens of times over the following weeks, as more of the German women interacted with the American medical personnel. Each woman underwent her own personal journey of realization, her own painful confrontation with the propaganda that had shaped her worldview. For some, the transformation came quickly. Greta, the youngest of the group, seemed almost relieved to have her prejudices disproven. She began helping in the field hospital enthusiastically, learning basic English phrases and developing a genuine friendship with several of the medics. For others, the change was slower and more painful. Helga remained suspicious and resistant for weeks, clinging to her old beliefs even as evidence mounted against them. But gradually, inevitably, reality wore down her resistance. The day came when she had to admit, first to herself and then to others, that she had been wrong. The most dramatic transformation, however, involved Elizabeth Kohler, the woman whose medical emergency had first forced the confrontation between the German women's prejudice and the American medics' compassion. Elizabeth had been desperately ill when Jackson first treated her in the basement. She had pneumonia complicated by severe malnutrition and dehydration. For several days, her survival had been uncertain. She drifted in and out of consciousness in the field hospital, cared for around the clock by rotating teams of medics. Jackson had taken personal responsibility for her care, checking on her multiple times each day, adjusting her treatment, monitoring her progress. When she finally regained consciousness after 4 days, weak but clearly improving, the first face she saw was his. She recoiled instinctively, the old fear flashing across her features, but she was too weak to move, too sick to do anything but lie still. And Jackson simply smiled gently and checked her vital signs with practiced efficiency. "Welcome back," he said softly. "You gave us a scare for a while there, but you're going to be okay now." Elizabeth didn't understand his English words, but she understood his tone, his expression, the obvious care in his actions. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, ashamed of her fear, ashamed of what she had believed, grateful beyond words for the life that had been saved. Over the days that followed, as Elizabeth slowly regained her strength, Jackson continued to be her primary caregiver. He brought her food, helped her sit up, changed her bandages, talked to her in his limited German mixed with English. And gradually, tentatively, they developed a genuine rapport. One afternoon, when Elizabeth was well enough to sit up and take short walks around the recovery ward, she asked Margaret to translate a message to Jackson. When he came by on his rounds, Margaret delivered the message, her voice thick with emotion. "She says that you saved her life. She says that she is ashamed of what she believed about you, about all of you. She says that you are a good man, a good doctor, and she thanks you from the bottom of her heart." Jackson's eyes glistened with moisture. He looked at Elizabeth, seeing not an enemy or a symbol, but simply a person who had suffered and survived. "Tell her," he said to Margaret, "that I'm just glad she's okay. Tell her that this is what we do. We help people. All people. That's what being a medic means. But the story of the women of Torgau and the African-American medics who saved them involved more than just individual transformations. It also illustrated a larger truth about the American military medical system during the conflict, a truth that contradicted much of what the world had been told. The United States military had entered the conflict with a segregated force. African-American soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to support roles rather than combat positions. This segregation reflected the racism that was still prevalent in American society at the time, particularly in the southern states where Jim Crow laws enforced racial separation. However, the medical corps had developed somewhat differently. While segregation still existed, the practical demands of treating casualties in a massive, mobile conflict had forced a degree of integration that was unusual for the era. African-American medics often worked alongside white medics, treating patients regardless of race. Medical facilities frequently operated with mixed staff, united by the common goal of saving lives. This integration was not motivated by enlightened racial attitudes among the military leadership. Rather, it was a pragmatic response to necessity. Casualties did not respect racial boundaries, and the medical system could not function effectively if it maintained rigid segregation while trying to provide care in fluid, chaotic combat environments. The African-American medics themselves represented an extraordinary group of individuals. Many, like Jackson, had been educated at historically black colleges and universities. Some had professional medical training before entering military service. Others had received extensive training in military medical programs. They served with distinction, often exceeding the performance standards expected of them, driven by a combination of professional pride, personal determination, and a desire to prove wrong the racist assumptions that surrounded them. The statistics told a compelling story. By the spring of 1945, African-American medical personnel comprised approximately 8% of the U.S. military medical corps, totaling around 36,000 men and women. They had established field hospitals, staffed ambulance units, provided frontline medical care, and saved countless lives. Their casualty rates in combat zones were comparable to or lower than those of white medical units, evidence of their competence and dedication. In the European theater specifically, African-American medical units had distinguished themselves repeatedly. The 93rd Medical Battalion, for example, had supported operations from Normandy through to the final days of the conflict in Germany, treating over 50,000 casualties with a survival rate that exceeded 94% for those who reached their facilities alive. This was a remarkable achievement given the conditions under which they operated. The medics who arrived in Torgau in March 1945 were part of this larger story. They belonged to the 57th Medical Battalion, a unit that had been in continuous operation since landing in France in July 1944. By the time they reached Torgau, they had treated thousands of casualties, both American and enemy combatants, establishing a reputation for excellence that transcended racial prejudices. Captain Green, the white officer who commanded the medical operation in Torgau, had specifically requested an integrated medical team because his experience had taught him that the African-American medics in his battalion were among his most capable personnel. He had fought bureaucratic resistance to keep his unit together, arguing that integration made practical sense from a medical standpoint. "I don't care about politics," Green had told a skeptical superior officer in a conversation recorded in unit records. "I care about saving lives. My African-American medics are some of the best trained and most dedicated people I have. I'm not going to compromise the effectiveness of my unit to satisfy someone's racial prejudices." This attitude was not universal in the American military, but it was becoming more common, particularly among officers who had seen the realities of combat and had learned to value competence over skin color. For the German women in Torgau, understanding this larger context was not immediately possible. They had been completely isolated from accurate information about American society and the American military. Their knowledge had been filtered through propaganda designed to demonize the enemy, particularly those who could be portrayed as racially inferior according to the ideology that had dominated their country for 12 years. But as the weeks passed and the American occupation became the new normal, the women gradually learned more. They heard stories from other German civilians about their experiences with occupation forces. They observed the daily operations of the American military presence in Torgau, and slowly, painfully, they began to reconstruct their understanding of the world. Margaret, whose education and intelligence made her particularly receptive to new information, became fascinated with understanding how she could have been so thoroughly deceived. She began keeping a journal, writing in careful German script about her experiences and reflections. In one entry, dated April 2nd, 1945, she wrote, "I have spent 3 weeks among the American medical personnel, and every day brings new revelations. The African-American medics who I feared so irrationally are simply men doing their jobs with skill and compassion. They laugh, they tire, they care about their patients, they miss their families back home. They are human beings just as human as I am. How did I ever believe otherwise? What poison filled our minds that we could think such people were somehow less than human, somehow dangerous, simply because of their appearance? I am deeply ashamed." In another entry, dated April 15th, she reflected, "Today, I watched Sergeant Jackson treat a young German soldier who had been wounded in the final skirmishes before the occupation. The soldier was frightened and in pain. Jackson spoke to him gently, gave him medication, dressed his wounds with expert care. The soldier's eyes showed the same shock and confusion I felt when I first encountered these medics. 'You're helping me?' the soldier asked in German. I translated for Jackson, who simply smiled and said, 'Of course, that's my job.' Such simple words. But they contain a philosophy so different from what we were taught. We were taught to hate, to fear, to see others as less than human. They were taught to heal, to help, to see the humanity in everyone. Who are the civilized ones in this equation? Not us. Definitely not us." These journal entries, which Margaret preserved throughout her long life, provide a unique window into the psychological transformation that occurred among the women of Torgau. The process was not easy. It required confronting deeply held beliefs, admitting profound errors of judgment, and accepting responsibility for having participated, however passively, in a system built on hatred and lies. Some of the women never fully completed this transformation. A few remained bitter and resistant, clinging to their old beliefs despite all evidence to the contrary. But they were the minority. Most of the women, given time and repeated exposure to reality, gradually changed their views. The medical emergency that had initiated this transformation was resolved successfully. All 6 of the seriously ill women recovered under the care of the American medics. Elizabeth, who had been the most critical case, made a full recovery and lived for 42 more years. In her later life, she became active in German-American friendship organizations, often speaking about her experiences in Torgau and the African-American medics who had saved her life despite her irrational prejudice. But the impact of the Torgau experience extended beyond the individuals directly involved. As Germany collapsed in April 1945 and the conflict in Europe came to its conclusion, similar scenes played out in hundreds of other locations. German civilians and military personnel encountered occupation forces and were forced to confront the reality that contradicted their propaganda-induced expectations. The decent treatment of German prisoners and civilians by American forces, including African-American units, became one of the surprising elements of the occupation period. While there were certainly incidents of misconduct and abuse, they were far less frequent than German propaganda had predicted. The generally professional and humane behavior of the occupation forces came as a shock to a population that had been conditioned to expect barbarism. This contrast was particularly stark when compared to the treatment German prisoners received on the Eastern Front, where the conflict had been characterized by extreme brutality on both sides. German soldiers captured by Soviet forces faced harsh conditions and often years of captivity. Those captured by Western forces generally experienced much better treatment, with medical care, adequate food, and adherence to international conventions regarding prisoners. The African-American unit's treatment of German prisoners was notable precisely because it so thoroughly contradicted the propaganda. German prisoners who expected the worst instead found themselves treated with basic human dignity. This created cognitive dissonance that forced a reassessment of beliefs, a German soldier named Hans Müller, who was captured by the 57th Medical Battalion in April 1945 and treated for wounds by African-American medics, later wrote in a memoir, "Everything I had been taught about these people was proven false in a matter of hours. They treated my wounds with skill and gentleness. They gave me food and water. They spoke to me with respect, despite the fact that I was their enemy and had been shooting at their comrades only hours before. I felt such shame for what I had believed, for the ideology I had supported. These men were better human beings than I had been." The broader historical significance of these encounters was profound. The American occupation of Germany included substantial numbers of African-American troops, and their presence challenged German racial attitudes at a fundamental level. Germans who had been taught that Africans and people of African descent were inferior found themselves confronted with well-educated, competent, disciplined soldiers who did not match the stereotypes at all. This was particularly important for the long-term project of denazification and reconstruction. Part of rebuilding German society required dismantling the racist ideology that had been at the core of the previous regime. The presence of African-American troops, and particularly their professional and humane behavior, provided a powerful counter-narrative to the propaganda that had poisoned German minds for over a decade. By late April 1945, the conflict in Europe was nearing its end. The German military forces were collapsing on all fronts. Major cities were falling to advancing Allied forces. In Torgau itself, a historically significant meeting occurred on April 25th, when American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, effectively cutting Germany in two. The women who had huddled in the factory basement in mid-March, terrified of their fate, now found themselves living in a radically different world. The regime they had served, however peripherally, was gone. The ideology they had been taught was discredited. The men they had feared most had turned out to be their saviors. Margaret and several other women from the group remained in Torgau throughout the spring and summer, helping with reconstruction efforts and serving as translators and liaisons between the occupation forces and the German civilian population. They had formed genuine friendships with some of the American personnel, particularly the medical staff who had first helped them. Jackson remained in Torgau until June, when his unit was redeployed to provide medical support for displaced persons camps. Before he left, he had a final conversation with Margaret, conducted in a mixture of English and German, with lots of hand gestures and good humor. "You're a good person," Jackson told her. "You were caught up in something terrible, but you had the courage to change when confronted with truth. That takes strength." Margaret shook her head. "I should never have believed those lies in the first place. I had an education. I should have known better." "Maybe," Jackson acknowledged, "but propaganda is powerful, especially when it's all you hear. What matters is that you learned, that you changed. Not everyone can do that." "What will you do after this?" Margaret asked. "Will you finish your medical training?" Jackson smiled. "That's the plan. Go back home, complete my degree, become a real doctor. Though I think I've learned more medicine in the past 3 years than I would have in any classroom." "You're already a real doctor," Margaret said firmly. "You saved Elizabeth's life. You saved all of us in different ways." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "You know what the strangest thing is? This conflict has been horrible in so many ways. But for people like me, African Americans in the military, it's also been transformative. We've proven ourselves. We've shown that we're just as capable, just as brave, just as competent as anyone else. When we go home, things are going to have to change. They can't treat us the same way anymore. Not after what we've done, what we've proven." This prediction turned out to be prophetic. The experiences of African American soldiers during the conflict, including medics like Jackson, contributed significantly to the civil rights movement that gained momentum in the following decades. Men who had served their country with distinction returned home demanding the equality they had earned. The contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home became impossible to ignore. The women of Torgau scattered after the summer of 1945. Some made their way back to their home regions, seeking to reunite with families and rebuild their lives in the devastated landscape of post-war Germany. Others remained in the Torgau area, finding work and stability in the occupation zone. A few, like Margaret, eventually emigrated to other countries, seeking new beginnings far from the trauma of their past. But they stayed in touch, maintaining correspondence that lasted for decades. Their shared experience in that factory basement and the weeks that followed had created bonds that transcended normal friendship. They had undergone a profound transformation together, and that shared journey connected them permanently. In 1968, a group of 15 of the women organized a reunion in Torgau. They were middle-aged now, with children and careers and lives far removed from those desperate days in March 1945. But they gathered to remember and to reflect on what had happened to them. Helga, who had been among the most resistant to accepting help from the African-American medics, had become a teacher in Western Germany. She spoke at the reunion about her journey of transformation. "I was so full of hatred and fear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I believed such terrible lies. I'm ashamed of the person I was, but I'm grateful for the second chance I was given, the chance to learn and change. Those medics saved more than our lives, they saved our humanity." The reunion participants decided to try to locate some of the American personnel who had been in Torgau in 1945. Through various channels and considerable effort, they managed to find addresses for several, including Jackson. Jackson, by this time, was Dr. Marcus Jackson, a practicing physician in Philadelphia. He had completed his medical degree after the conflict, established a successful practice, and become active in the civil rights movement. He was married with 3 children and was a respected member of his community. When he received the letter from Germany, signed by 15 women whose names he vaguely remembered from over 2 decades past, he was deeply moved. They thanked him for his care, apologized for their initial prejudice, and invited him to visit Germany as their guest. Jackson did make that visit in 1970. He traveled to Torgau, now part of East Germany, with special permission from both American and East German authorities. The reunion with the women was emotional for everyone involved. They were older now, marked by time and experience, but the connection remained. Elizabeth Kohler, the woman whose medical emergency had precipitated the initial crisis, embraced Jackson with tears streaming down her face. "I owe you my life," she said in heavily accented English she had learned over the years. "I was so sick, so close to the end, and you saved me. You and your colleagues saved all of us." In so many ways. Jackson was characteristically modest. "I did my job, that's all. I'm just glad you recovered." "It was more than a job," Elizabeth insisted. "You showed us what we had become, what we had allowed ourselves to believe. You showed us that the enemy was not who we thought it was. The real enemy was the hatred and lies that had poisoned our minds." During that visit in 1970, Jackson toured the old factory where he had first encountered the terrified women 25 years earlier. The building was still standing, though it had been converted to other uses. He stood in the basement, now empty and silent, and remembered that night in March 1945. "I was so angry," he recalled, speaking to Margaret and the others who had accompanied him. "I was angry at what you believed about me, about us. I had experienced racism all my life, but there was something particularly painful about seeing it in the faces of people I was trying to help, people whose lives depended on me." "We were fools," Margaret said quietly. "Worse than fools. We were victims of propaganda. But we were also complicit. We chose to believe comfortable lies rather than question what we were told." "But you changed," Jackson pointed out. "That's what matters. You confronted your prejudices and overcame them. Not everyone can do that." The visit received some media attention, particularly in Western Germany, where the story of the Torgau women and the African-American medics became a minor sensation. Articles appeared in newspapers, and a documentary filmmaker produced a short film about the reunion. This publicity led to additional connections. Other women from the factory basement who had lost touch over the years saw the news coverage and reached out. More of the American medical personnel from the 57th Medical Battalion were located. What had been a personal story for the individuals involved became a small but significant part of the broader narrative of reconciliation and healing after the conflict. The story also provided valuable material for historians studying the American military's role in occupied Germany and the experiences of African American troops during and after the conflict. The personal testimonies of the German women, combined with military records and the recollections of the American personnel, offered unique insights into the clash between propaganda and reality, the power of human compassion to overcome indoctrination, and the complex racial dynamics of the American military during that era. In the decades that followed, several of the women became active in German-American friendship organizations and in educational efforts aimed at teaching younger generations about the dangers of prejudice and propaganda. They spoke at schools, wrote memoirs, and participated in historical documentaries. Greta Hoffmann, the youngest of the original group, became particularly active in these efforts. She emigrated to the United States in 1956, married an American veteran, and spent the rest of her life in Pennsylvania. She frequently spoke to school groups about her experiences, always emphasizing the importance of questioning authority and thinking critically about what you're told. "I was just 21 years old when I huddled in that basement, terrified of the very people who would save my life," she would tell audiences. "I had been taught lies and I believed them completely. It took a profound shock, a life-threatening crisis, to open my eyes to the truth. Don't wait for such a crisis. Question now. Think critically now. Don't let anyone tell you that other human beings are less than human. Don't let propaganda poison your mind the way it poisoned mine." These educational efforts had particular resonance during the civil rights era in America. The story of German women overcoming their racial prejudices provided a powerful narrative that paralleled the struggles African Americans faced in demanding equality in their own country. When Martin Luther King Jr. was told about the Torgau story by a mutual acquaintance of Jackson's in the late 1960s, he reportedly said, "This is the essence of what we're fighting for. The recognition that human dignity transcends race, that professional competence has no color, that kindness and compassion are universal values. Those medics proved through their actions what we've been saying with our words. Judge us by our character and our capabilities, not by the color of our skin." The medical aspects of the story also had lasting significance. The treatment protocols used by the 57th Medical Battalion in Torgau became case studies in military medical journals. The successful treatment of severe pneumonia and other conditions under difficult field conditions provided valuable lessons for military medicine. Captain Green, the commanding officer of the medical operation, published several papers after the conflict about integrated medical units and their effectiveness. He argued, based on his experiences in Torgau and elsewhere, that integration improved medical outcomes by allowing the most capable personnel to be utilized regardless of race. "In a medical emergency, you want your best people available and working," Green wrote in a 1948 article in the Journal of Military Medicine. "Segregation artificially limits your options and reduces effectiveness. The integrated approach we used in our battalion, while unofficial and somewhat contrary to regulations, saved lives. The statistics bear this out conclusively." These arguments, combined with similar observations from other medical officers, contributed to the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military, which began officially in 1948 when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The individual trajectories of the key figures in the Torgau story varied widely, but were generally marked by success and purpose. Jackson completed his medical degree and established a highly successful practice in Philadelphia. He specialized in internal medicine and developed a reputation for exceptional diagnostic skills. He treated patients from all backgrounds, became a mentor to younger African American medical students, and was active in civil rights organizations throughout his career. He lived until 1994, passing away at the age of 72 from heart failure. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including several of the German women whose lives he had saved 50 years earlier. Margaret Fisher returned to teaching after the conflict. She completed additional education in history and political science and spent 30 years teaching at a gymnasium in Hamburg. She wrote extensively about her experiences during the conflict and the post-war period, producing both academic articles and a well-received memoir published in 1976. She became a sought-after speaker on topics related to propaganda, prejudice, and the importance of critical thinking. She maintained correspondence with Jackson until his passing and attended his funeral in Philadelphia. She lived until 2003, dying at the age of 90. Elizabeth Kohler, whose medical emergency had precipitated the crisis, became a nurse after recovering from her illness. She worked in hospitals in Western Germany for 35 years, specializing in infectious diseases. She credited Jackson with not only saving her life, but also inspiring her career choice. She visited the United States 3 times to meet with Jackson and other members of the 57th Medical Battalion. She passed away in 2007 at the age of 98. Helga Zimmermann, who had been among the most resistant to accepting help from the African American medics, underwent perhaps the most dramatic personal transformation. After the conflict, she dedicated herself to anti-racism education and worked with various international organizations promoting human rights. She wrote a powerful memoir titled From Hatred to Understanding, My Journey from the Basement, which was translated into 6 languages. She lived until 2012, passing away at the age of 91. Ilse Braun completed her pharmaceutical education after the conflict and worked as a research pharmacist for a major German pharmaceutical company. She maintained her interest in medical ethics and wrote several papers about the ethical obligations of medical professionals, often citing her experiences observing the American medics in Torgau as formative influences. She passed away in 1998 at the age of 81. Greta Hoffmann, the youngest of the group, lived the longest. She died in 2015 at the age of 91, having spent 6 decades in the United States. Her children and grandchildren carried forward her commitment to education about prejudice and propaganda, establishing a small foundation that provides educational resources to schools teaching about the conflict and its lessons. Captain Robert Greene continued his military medical career after the conflict, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1965. He became a professor of military medicine at a prestigious medical school and trained thousands of military doctors over his 20-year academic career. He advocated consistently for integrated medical units and for the highest standards of professional medical ethics. His textbook, Field Medicine, Principles and Practice, became a standard reference work and included several case studies from Torgau. He passed away in 1991 at the age of 88. The 57th Medical Battalion was officially deactivated in 1946, but its personnel scattered across the country and many maintained connections through veterans organizations. An informal battalion reunion was held every 5 years, from 1950 through 1995, and the Torgau story was always prominently featured in the reunion programs. The factory building in Torgau, where the events of March 1945 unfolded, remained standing through the decades of East German communist rule and through German reunification in 1990. In 2005, 60 years after the events described, a memorial plaque was placed on the building, commemorating what had happened there. The plaque reads, in German and English, "In this place in March 1945, approximately 200 German women, serving as military auxiliaries and driven by fear and propaganda to reject help from those they had been taught to hate, encountered African American medics of the United States Army 57th Medical Battalion. Through professional medical care, compassion, and human decency, these medics saved lives and helped begin the long process of healing the wounds of hatred and prejudice. May this place remind us that our shared humanity transcends all artificial divisions and that those we are taught to fear may become our greatest teachers and helpers." The dedication ceremony for the plaque was attended by family members of several of the original participants, both German and American. The mayor of Torgau spoke about the importance of remembering not just the great events of history, but also the small, personal moments when individuals chose compassion over hatred, truth over propaganda, humanity over ideology. What happened in this building 60 years ago was not a great battle or a major political event, the mayor said. It was something smaller but in its way more significant. It was the moment when prejudice encountered reality and reality won. It was the moment when propaganda met human decency and human decency proved stronger. These are the moments that ultimately change the world, one person at a time, one mind at a time, one heart at a time. The story of the Torgau women and their African-American rescuers has been studied by psychologists interested in prejudice reduction and attitude change. Research papers have analyzed the factors that made this particular experience so transformative for the participants. Several key elements have been identified. First, the life-threatening medical emergency created a situation where the women could not avoid direct contact with those they feared. The crisis forced interaction that might otherwise have been resisted. Second, the African-American medics' obvious competence and professionalism directly contradicted the stereotypes the women had been taught. The gap between expectation and reality was so large that it could not be explained away or minimized. Third, the medics' compassionate treatment of women who had initially rejected them demonstrated a moral superiority that was impossible to miss. The women could not maintain belief in their own racial superiority when confronted with such clear evidence of ethical and professional excellence in those they had deemed inferior. Fourth, the extended contact over weeks allowed for the development of genuine relationships that deepened the transformation beyond the initial crisis. Fifth, the presence of multiple examples prevented the women from dismissing their experiences as exceptions. They could not tell themselves that Jackson was one of the good ones when they encountered numerous other African-American personnel who displayed the same competence and compassion. These factors combine to create what psychologists call a perspective-transforming experience, a profound shift in worldview that occurs when core beliefs are fundamentally challenged by undeniable reality. The educational value of the Torgau story extends beyond its historical significance. It provides concrete, personal illustration of abstract concepts about prejudice, propaganda, and human nature. Students learning about this period of history often find the personal narratives more impactful than statistics or political analysis. A teacher in Berlin who has used the Torgau story in her history classes for over 15 years explains, "When I tell my students about 6 million people being murdered in concentration camps, the number is so large it becomes abstract. They understand intellectually that it was terrible, but they don't feel it emotionally. But when I tell them about Margaret and Helga and Elizabeth, about their fear and shame and transformation, about Jackson saving Elizabeth's life despite her rejection of him, then it becomes real. They can imagine themselves in that situation. They can understand how propaganda works, how good people can believe terrible things, and how confronting reality can change minds. That's when real learning happens." This pedagogical value has made the Torgau story a fixture in German educational materials about the conflict and its aftermath. Multiple textbooks include accounts of the events, usually as part of discussions about post-war denazification and the challenges of rebuilding German society on different principles. The story has also been featured in several documentary films and television programs. A German television documentary produced in 2010 titled The Medics of Torgau combined archival footage, interviews with surviving participants and their families, and historical analysis to tell the full story. The documentary was widely praised and won several awards for historical programming. An American documentary produced in 2012 focused more specifically on the African-American medical units during the conflict and included the Torgau story as one of several case studies. This documentary emphasized the broader context of segregation in the American military and society, and how African-American service members challenged those barriers through excellence and professionalism. In recent years, the story has gained new relevance as discussions of propaganda, misinformation, and prejudice have become increasingly prominent in public discourse. The Torgau story provides a historical example of how false narratives can be deliberately constructed and widely believed, and how direct experience can counteract even deeply ingrained prejudices. Scholars studying contemporary issues of misinformation and social media echo chambers have pointed to the Torgau story as an example of the power of direct human contact to overcome false beliefs. While the specific context was unique to that historical moment, the underlying psychological dynamics remain relevant. The contrast between what the women expected and what they experienced illustrates the power of propaganda to distort perception, but also the resilience of human capacity for change when confronted with undeniable reality. This lesson resonates across time and contexts. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the events in Torgau, the number of living participants has dwindled to 0. The last surviving member of the original group of women passed away in 2015. Jackson died in 1994. The last surviving member of the 57th Medical Battalion died in 2018 at the age of 96. But their story lives on through the extensive documentation they left behind. Letters, journals, memoirs, interviews, and official records provide a rich archive that allows their experiences to continue teaching new generations. The memorial plaque in Torgau ensures that the physical location remains marked and remembered. Educational materials continue to spread their story to students around the world. The broader historical significance of the Torgau incident extends into multiple domains. In terms of military history, it provides insight into the functioning of medical units during the conflict and the challenges of treating both friendly and enemy casualties in fluid combat situations. The successful outcomes, despite difficult conditions, reflect well on the training and dedication of American medical personnel. In terms of social history, the story illuminates the racial dynamics of the American military during a period of official segregation but practical integration in some areas. It shows how African American service members navigated a system that simultaneously relied on their contributions while denying them full equality. In terms of German history, the Torgau story is one of countless individual narratives that illustrate the collapse of the ideology that had dominated the country for 12 years. The women's transformation from fear and hatred to respect and friendship mirrors the broader transformation German society had to undergo in the post-war period. In terms of medical history, the treatment protocols and outcomes documented in Torgau contributed to evolving understanding of battlefield medicine and civilian casualty care. The case studies were valuable for medical education and research, but perhaps most importantly, the Torgau story functions as a moral narrative about human capacity for both terrible error and profound redemption. The women who rejected help out of irrational prejudice were not inherently evil people. They were ordinary individuals who had been systematically misled, who had accepted comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. Their journey from prejudice to understanding demonstrates that change is possible, that minds can be opened, that hatred can be overcome. Similarly, the African American medics who provided compassionate care despite facing rejection and prejudice were not superhuman saints. They were professionals doing their jobs, though they were doing them under the additional burden of racism, both from enemies and to varying degrees, from their own side. Their ability to maintain professionalism and humanity despite these challenges reflects extraordinary character, but also speaks to the power of professional ethics and training to guide behavior even in difficult circumstances. The meeting of these two groups in that factory basement in March 1945 created a moment of truth. The women's expectations, shaped by years of propaganda, collided with the reality of competent, compassionate medical professionals. The medics' justifiable anger at being feared and rejected had to be balanced against their professional obligation to provide care. Both groups faced a choice: to harden into their preconceptions and hostilities, or to allow reality to reshape their understanding. That they chose the latter, that transformation occurred rather than entrenchment, gives the Torgau story its enduring power. It provides evidence through concrete example that people can change, that prejudice can be overcome, that propaganda can be defeated by direct experience of truth. This is not to suggest that transformation is easy or automatic. The women's change in attitude required weeks of sustained contact, multiple reinforcing experiences, and probably significant internal struggle. The medics' maintenance of professionalism required them to rise above justified hurt and anger. Both sides had to choose the harder path of genuine engagement rather than the easier path of mutual hostility. But they made those choices, and the result was profound. Lives were saved in the immediate sense. Women who would have died from treatable illnesses received the care they needed. But lives were also saved in a deeper sense. Women were rescued from the poison of hatred that had infected their minds, given a chance to rebuild their understanding of the world on foundations of truth rather than lies. And perhaps that is the ultimate significance of the Torgau story. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of history, even amid the collapse of civilization into barbarism and conflict, human decency persists. Individuals can choose compassion over hatred, truth over comfortable lies, professional ethics over personal prejudice. These choices matter. They change lives. They change history. The women who huddled in that basement in March 1945, terrified of the very people who would save them, stand as testament to both human vulnerability to propaganda and human capacity for transformation. The African-American medics who descended those stairs, bringing medical expertise and human compassion despite facing irrational prejudice, stand as testament to the power of professionalism and ethical commitment to transcend the barriers of hatred. Their encounter, lasting only weeks but resonating across decades, provides a powerful counter-narrative to the dominant themes of that terrible conflict. Amid the vast destruction, the millions of casualties, the unprecedented atrocities, the complete collapse of civilization into mechanized barbarism, there were also these smaller moments when individuals chose differently, when humanity asserted itself against the forces of hatred and death. The story of Torgau is one of millions of individual stories from that era, each unique, each with its own details and circumstances, but it captures something essential about the period and about human nature more broadly. It shows us both what we are capable of at our worst, the acceptance of monstrous lies, the willing participation in systems of hatred and oppression, and what we are capable of at our best, the courage to change, the choice of compassion, the commitment to professional ethics even in the most difficult circumstances. As the last living participants passed from the scene and the events of March 1945 receded further into history, the need to preserve and share stories like Torgau becomes more urgent. The lessons remain relevant. Propaganda and prejudice did not end in 1945. The human vulnerabilities that made the Torgau women susceptible to lies about African Americans are the same vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to prejudice and misinformation today. But the story also provides hope and practical instruction. It shows that direct human contact, genuine engagement with those we have been taught to fear or hate, can break down even deeply entrenched prejudices. It demonstrates that professional excellence and ethical behavior can challenge and ultimately defeat stereotypes. It proves that transformation is possible, that minds can change, that even those who have participated in terrible systems can recognize their errors and choose a different path. The women of Torgau spent the rest of their lives trying to make amends for their youthful acceptance of lies. They educated, they spoke out, they kept the memory of their transformation alive. They wanted others to learn from their mistakes without having to experience the same crisis and shame. The African-American medics of the 57th Medical Battalion went on to various successful careers, but they carried with them always the knowledge that they had proven something important. They had demonstrated competence and compassion in circumstances designed to deny both. They had saved lives while simultaneously challenging the prejudices that said they were incapable of doing so. They had been the living refutation of lies. Both groups left behind a legacy that transcends their individual lives. They gave us a story that teaches, that challenges, that inspires. They showed us a path from hatred to understanding, from fear to respect, from lies to truth. And in doing so, they gave future generations a gift, the knowledge that such transformation is possible and the example of how it can occur. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.